The strains of the call to prayer can be heard along the narrow lanes of a market here in the United Arab Emirates, where thousands came together earlier this month for a special United Nations summit. 5 days of discussions on the future of cities all around the world. It was in many ways an unlikely place to hold a conference about sustainability in a region better known for producing and consuming carbon-emitting fossil fuels. Still, the host capital, Abu Dhabi, put its best foot forward, offering delegates a tour of a pilot eco-city, Masdar City, which features a compact design somewhat similar to Greenwich Village, in stark contrast to the skyscrapers and superblocks that's the predominant pattern of real estate development around here. The 10th World Urban Forum was organized by UN Habitat, the UN agency whose stated mission is to promote socially and environmentally sustainable human settlement and achieve adequate shelter for all. It's no small challenge. Cities and towns are growing rapidly, with a staggering influx of people moving to urban areas in search of a better life. With every passing month, the UN says, the equivalent of a new city the size of Madrid is created. Urbanization generates economic growth and social and political advances, as well as technical and scientific progress, but when poorly managed, it can generate poverty, social exclusion, and environmental degradation. The theme for this World Urban Forum, held for the first time in the Arab region, it's held every 2 years in different locations all around the world. The theme was fostering innovation and respecting local culture, the suggestion being that good ideas for better functioning cities are desperately needed and welcome wherever they come from. The UN is urging cities everywhere to meet a series of targets known as the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Yes, in the world of the UN, everything gets its own acronym. Many of these goals are associated with cities where 2/3 of the world's population will reside by 2050. Currently, it's over 55%, more than 4 billion people in burgeoning metropolitan areas, mostly in the developing world. Over the course of the conference, the Lincoln Institute was prominent among other foundations and non-governmental organizations in sharing proven techniques for financing a more sustainable future for cities. Infrastructure, resilience, affordable housing, open space, through innovative policies including land value capture. That's a fresh approach to development that recognizes how government actions like a zoning change or building infrastructure like a transit line creates massive increases in private property values, so the public is entitled to get some of that back. Otherwise, according to Martim Smoka, senior fellow at the Lincoln Institute, when governments rezone areas, say, from rural to commercial or residential, it's like a big gift to landowners and developers. If a landowner buys property for $1,000 and sells it 2 years later for $2,000, there is nothing that landowner has done to earn that increase, Smoka said. The increase is due to everything that's going on all around that parcel. Under land value capture, also known as land value return, a portion of that revenue gets plowed back into neighborhoods to make improvements for lower-income residents. Enrica Silva, director of international and institute-wide programs at the Lincoln Institute, shared the experience of several places that have tried different versions of land value capture, from Sao Paulo in Brazil to Colombia, India, Europe, Japan, and beyond. This time more than ever, representatives of a number of other organizations were also talking about value capture, including the World Bank, the International Development Bank, the World Resources Institute, and the Europe-based Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. The takeaway? The paradigm for urbanization needs to be changed because right now it's not working so well. An estimated 1 billion people, that's 1 in 4 out of that 4 billion total living in cities, are in slums or informal settlement, in substandard conditions and without access to basic services. In one training workshop, a veteran of many World Urban Forum summits, architect and urban planner Claudio Acioly, helped explain how the worldwide housing crisis got to be so bad. I caught up with him afterwards to find out more about what cities are doing to manage the problem of slums and how the challenge of decent, affordable housing is by no means limited to the developing world.
We have a global housing affordability crisis. When we say affordability, is that the ability of households to pay for housing that is offered in their market, standard housing, is becoming unaffordable. So that result that people opt to go either overcrowding families, sub-renting, or even illegal rooftops, or they invade land, they encroach, or you have this massive, in some parts of the world, this massive informal urbanization. So if we step back a little bit and we look at our cities. If you cross LA and you see this massive amount of people living in tents, in shacks, and living on streets, you ask yourself, why is that? Why is that we have 80,000 people in a country like the US, in a city like LA, a booming city with an incredible economy, but there are people who are falling out? It could be in Dhaka, Bangladesh. If you take a photo in a certain way, you could easily say this could be anywhere.
These homeless camps in LA.
Yeah.
So it's not just a international developing world problem.
Yeah, so there are different reasons, but there is a commonality why housing has become so expensive vis-a-vis the ability of people and households or their income to afford what is there. The first is that land. So land has become scarce for social housing. There is, for different reasons, a hold up of land that is not supplied for providing affordable housing. There are, in some places, undeveloped housing finance, which does not provide a diversity of, let's say, opportunities for people with different income to apply for credit, to be eligible for particular support so that they can afford to purchase a house. And to a certain degree, in some countries, I would call a unilateral policy where rental housing does not appear as an option for people to climb up in the early stage. So young adults or newly married, they need a first step in the housing market, which is usually either a social rental or just rental accommodation that could be offered widely in countries. So we know that, for example, in a country like US or in a country like the Netherlands, so I'm talking about the wealthiest countries in the world, you have a certain amount of the house stock in rental mode of occupation. So if we can combine home ownership and rental, you start already solving part of the problem, because some people would be able to actually find affordable rental housing if that is supply. And on the next to that, the capacity of local governments to invest in infrastructure, to increase the supply of service land, which would then boost the production of housing, so the supply side of the market, is not taking place. The financial health, if we call it like that, of local government, and the scarcity of mechanisms for local governments to actually, and national governments in some countries, to apply for certain, let's say, long-term loans for producing housing, has become a serious problem. So the result is that where do you go? You look in our cities and you see the physical manifestation of the lack of affordable housing, informal housing, badly maintained buildings, expensive, illegal, informal rents. You have all kind of solution that is becoming visible in cities in the north and in the south.
So people are being effectively pushed into informal settlement, into slums, substandard conditions. In some cases, they're functioning neighborhoods, but there's a lot of pretty precarious living going on out there, especially in the developing world, as all these hundreds of thousands of people move into cities each year. They're going straight into these neighborhoods, these occupied, technically illegal areas, and just getting by as best as they can?
Well, we have some patterns, and depending on some regions, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa and some part in Southeast Asia, urbanization has become a synonym of informal urbanization or the appearance of slums. So cities are becoming like 70% informal. So what does it mean when we say this is that the cities are not coping to absorb the population growth and the demographic pressure for land infrastructure in a planned manner. So people together or individually, they find a place, they occupy the land, and before you know, you have a settlement of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. And we don't see, like in the 70s in Latin America, where you have those huge movements of mass invasion of land organized by community groups, because that was the only way to come to a place in the city. But you do have a lot of encroachments taking place and the densification of these informal areas. So there in Latin America, we observe that the big metropolitan areas are decreasing their population growth rates. So people are not finding accommodation in these cities, and they go to these areas, and you see this verticalization, the encroachment, and things are getting out of hand in some places because the public space is taken by people who are desperate to be close to jobs or close to schools or close to infrastructure. Otherwise, they would have to go to very far peripheries.
Now, this is going to be a big question, but what to do? Your presentation earlier here at the World Urban Forum 10, you suggested that there were at least two pathways. One of them had to do with upgrading or trying to improve conditions in existing informal areas, and then the other path has to do with prevention, to try to get back to the origins of the problem and put in policies that will prevent, this furious spread of informal settlement. So could you talk about that, and I guess start with upgrading this idea of improving conditions, at least in some of these areas?
Yeah. Good question. This is not new. So American cities and European cities in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, started with the urban renewal programs. They realized that the slum clearance policies were not bringing the solutions they expected, so they realized that it was a much better policy to upgrade the housing stock, improve the living conditions in the existing neighborhoods, and allow people to stay where they are and not disturb or disrupt their economic and social linkage with the place where they live, they work, schools, etc. So there was a close link, it was an understanding. That policy came much later to the developing world. And people realized that slum clearance policies and building massive housing, social housing, popular housing, different names, low-cost housing, very small, far away, where land was cheap, didn't work either. You create very critical social problems. The most famous one, The City of God, which was a film showing that was a typical slum clearance settlement that create the City of God. And this, in many Latin American metropolises, was sponsored by the Alliance of Progress. So taxpayers from U.S. were actually financing the USAID program on taking away these horrible slums and favelas that were huge by then in the 60s. So what we argue that some of these areas are so consolidated, people have generations there, they have managed to put a lot of their own resources there. Because the government doesn't have the means and resources to say, okay, let's clean up this and make something new. You don't have that kind of money anymore. So in those areas where it is feasible and optimal to upgrade, we should upgrade. But not, one project here. We should go citywide. And in some countries, nationwide.
Well, let's talk more about Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, and Goal 11 has to do with sustainable cities. This gathering here, UN Habitat, is organizing the principles that are articulated in the SDGs. Is it a good framework, in your opinion, particularly with regard to setting new policies to prevent this kind of phenomenon? Are they a good set of goals, and do you think they are achievable?
I think you touched the heart of the development challenge. The Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, in my view, is the most ambitious agenda of humanity ever formulated. And it's universal, and it turned all countries in the world, developing countries, because they all had to commit to achieve a number of these goals on several areas, on poverty, on hunger, on housing, air quality, on solid waste, education. So the goal, the ambitious goal, is that no one is left behind. And we have now exactly 10 years to at least come very close to achievement to those goals and set another sort of agenda and compromise of the world of nations to say, how do we go from here to the next 10 years? It set 17 different goals that were agreed after the global conference Rio Plus 20, where all member states, Brazil, Holland, US, agreed to promote a transformation which were set in a document called The Future We Want. And there all the countries of the world agreed to 2 years later define bold goals that would replace the Millennium Development Goals. And that is in 2014, then all countries of the nation set up their commitments and their targets. So the US set its target, Brazil set its target, Bangladesh set its target, India. So all countries set their targets and presented that commitment to the world community of nations and all societies of the world. So Goal 11, as you said, aims to create into 2030 cities that are sustainable, inclusive, safe, and resilient. That's the bold goal, to create a city that can prosper for everyone so that no one is left behind.
Now, the target date is 2030. That's the idea anyway. That's the target date. Now, do all of these cities and nations report on their progress? Is there some way to see if various policies are working or not?
The voluntary report are the reports that nations, so national governments, are presenting to the world. But then we have another variable here, that many of the targets of the Goal 11, they're local, they're city. And that is the interesting why I said it brings me back to US. New York came in the forefront and made it the first city voluntary report. And there, if you go and see the report of New York, they put their very bold goals on target 11.1, which is affordable housing for all and upgrading of slums. Okay, maybe New York doesn't have the slums we know elsewhere, but they have probably dilapidated neighborhoods or poor housing that needs to be upgraded, so it's part of the equation. And I read about it, and it's one of the most ambitious affordable housing program in the history of US. So cities now are taking charge of the well-being of their citizens and putting up bold policies where they are allowed to. When I say they are allowed to, because in some countries like Brazil, municipal autonomy is constitutionally protected. So that means above the mayor, only the law. There is no governor, there is no president. The mayor is accountable to the citizen and the law, and he needs to put its municipal policy. And then you see more and more cities embracing the SDGs.
This is probably an even tougher question, but what's the mood? What's the optimistic, pessimistic around here at UN Habitat? What's the thinking about how realistic it is to have cities achieve these goals?
That's a tough one. I think it brings us back to the early discussions. Obviously, that development integrated. So I cannot only talk about housing or slum upgrading without talking about access to education, access to income, jobs. And it's not an easy thing to do because some parts of the world, cities have not set up their property tax, their mechanisms of self-finance, and are fully dependent of transfer from central governments, and where resources are scarce. So you have to use your creativity and create inside your constituency instruments that allows you to access cash to implement some of the bold policies that you formulate. But there are ways to do that. How? First, in my view, problems that are out there should not be looked at as a government problem. It is a society problem. And when you look from that perspective, you bring the private sector, you bring the education sector like universities, the researchers, civil society groups, and you bring everyone to the table of negotiations that how do we prioritize this? So we have X number of years, we have that amount of resources, how do we do that? We need more resources, how do we do that? Do we have the instruments inside, value capture, transfer of development rights, creating a local fund, going internationally and get access to international finance, which is backed by your national government? So one of the equation is finance. So that's why you see here a lot of discussion about SDG finance. Yesterday I was in a group. They were discussing very much about the amount of money that is available in pension funds, in different kinds of funds around the world that are ready to invest on climate mitigation, social policy, etc. But cities are not coming up with projects, with sound, well-thought projects. But in the conversation, there was no city, there was no mayor. So my point was, look, many mayors in many cities have legal, institutional, political difficulties to overcome. So not every country has a mayor that can just sign an agreement with the finance institutions and just go. There are many steps you need to do. So then brings us with the issue of capacity building. We need to strengthen the capacity of institutions, not only government but outside government, to actually be able to absorb these goals and transform them into actions.
It sounds like a pretty good plan. We're all very hopeful. Claudio, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The World Urban Forum wrapped up with a declaration confirming a worldwide commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and a new hope for reaching them by 2030. The next World Urban Forum will be in 2022 in Poland. That's it for this episode of the Land Matters podcast, recorded live in Abu Dhabi. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.